The Galactic Defense Academy existed in that peculiar state of institutional grandeur, where everything was simultaneously cutting-edge and bureaucratically absurd. Floating serenely above the gas giant Nexus Prime, the Academy's crystalline spires twisted through space like the fever dream of an architect who'd consumed too much synthetic caffeine. Here, the galaxy's finest young minds came to learn the delicate art of not getting everyone killed during the next inevitable cosmic crisis, which, if history served as any indicator, would arrive roughly every Tuesday. The Academy's halls hummed with the quiet confidence of beings who knew they were destined for greatness. Tall, graceful Etherians glided past with their luminescent skin patterns pulsing in complex mathematical sequences. Crystalline geodes clicked and chimed as they calculated orbital mechanics in their heads for fun. Multi-armed Nexarians juggled holographic star charts while discussing theoretical physics in harmonious tones that made lesser beings weep with inadequacy. And then there was the human. She sat in the back corner of advanced tactical theory, a position she'd claimed not through strategic thinking but because it was closest to the door and therefore optimal for quick escapes when discussions turned to topics requiring actual competence. Her uniform hung slightly too loose, giving her the appearance of someone who'd borrowed clothes from a more successful sibling. Brown hair pulled back in a regulation ponytail that somehow managed to look regulation adjacent at best. Eyes that seemed permanently fixed in that expression of polite attention mastered by students everywhere who were desperately trying to appear engaged while their minds wandered to more pressing concerns, like whether the cafeteria would serve actual food today or another round of nutritionally optimized protein cubes. Professor Vax, a crystalline whose body structure resembled a living chandelier having an existential crisis, was explaining the finer points of fleet maneuvering to a class that absorbed information like particularly gifted sponges. His voice resonated through multiple harmonic frequencies, a natural ability that made every lecture sound like a symphony of wisdom. The key to successful large-scale engagement, he chimed, his crystalline form shifting through prismatic colors, lies not in brute force, but in understanding the fundamental psychology of your opponent. What drives them? What do they fear? What assumptions do they make about reality itself? The Etherian students nodded, their skin patterns brightening with comprehension. The Nexarians' multiple hands moved in perfect synchronization as they took notes on devices that probably cost more than most planets' annual defense budget. Even the notoriously difficult Void Dwellers managed expressions that could charitably be interpreted as engaged. The human, meanwhile, was doodling what appeared to be a highly detailed schematic of a sandwich in her notebook margin. Professor Vax paused, his harmonic voice carrying just the slightest note of what other species might mistake for uncertainty. The pause stretched long enough for several students to glance back at the human, who looked up with the startled expression of someone caught red-handed committing the crime of inattention. "Ah yes," she said, as if this constituted a complete response to whatever question hadn't actually been asked. "Perhaps you'd care to share your thoughts on the psychological warfare applications of apparent weakness." The classroom fell silent. This was the sort of question that separated the future admirals from the future casualties. It required not just textbook knowledge, but the kind of strategic insight that academics spent decades trying to quantify and inevitably failed to capture in their neat theoretical framework. The human blinked slowly, like a processing unit struggling with an unexpected input. "Well," she began, her voice carrying none of the confident resonance of her classmates, "I suppose if someone thinks you're not worth worrying about, they might not worry about you." The silence stretched. Several students exchanged glances that conveyed entire dissertations on the topic of human inadequacy. But Professor Vax's crystalline structure shifted to a warm amber hue, an emotional indicator that his species typically reserved for moments of particular satisfaction. "Indeed," he chimed, and there was something in that single word that felt like a door opening. Class dismissed. As students filed out in their usual clusters of academic excellence, the human gathered her materials with the unhurried pace of someone who had nowhere particularly important to be. Her notebook, filled with sandwich schematics and half-completed equations that would have made mathematicians weep, disappeared into a bag that had seen better decades. She didn't notice Professor Vax's harmonic farewell carrying an extra note of what could only be described as anticipation. Nor did she catch the way Professor Harith, the Void Dweller who taught applied combat psychology, paused in the hallway to exchange what passed for meaningful looks with Professor Vax. Among beings who communicated partially through controlled manipulation of localized space-time, such exchanges carried considerably more weight than mere eye contact. The human walked past them both, heading toward her next class with the determined stride of someone who'd mastered the art of looking purposeful while having absolutely no idea what they were doing. Behind her, the professor's conversation continued in frequencies inaudible to most species. Still maintaining the facade, Harris' gravitational field inquired. Beautifully, Bax harmonized back. Though I suspect the pretense is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. The others don't suspect? The students? Please. They're so busy demonstrating their superiority they couldn't recognize genuine strategic thinking if it introduced itself and provided references. The human disappeared around a corner, probably heading toward basic mathematics, where she would undoubtedly continue her impressive streak of barely passing grades, while somehow managing to solve problems in ways that made the automated grading systems malfunction. Professor Harris' gravitational signature carried the equivalent of a chuckle. How much longer do you think she can keep this up? Given the current trajectory, Bax's form shifted through several contemplative hues. I'd say we'll find out soon enough. The Academy has a way of presenting situations that make pretense impractical. They separated, each heading toward their respective offices, leaving the hallway empty except for the lingering sense that something significant had just occurred, disguised as absolutely nothing at all. In the distance, the sound of the human asking a classmate if anyone knew whether the library actually contained books or just more holographic disappointments, echoed off the crystalline walls, a perfectly ordinary question that somehow managed to suggest that ordinary questions might be the most dangerous ones of all. 3 weeks into the semester, the human had achieved what could generously be called a pattern. Her scores hovered in that mathematical sweet spot where failure and mediocrity engaged in an eternal dance of mutual indecision. 47% in xenobiology, 51% in strategic planning, a truly spectacular 39% in advanced weapons systems, which was particularly impressive considering the exam had been multiple choice with only 3 possible answers. The other students had stopped bothering to glance at her during discussions. Why would they? The Etherian twins had already solved next semester's final project in their spare time, creating a tactical simulation so elegant it made senior officers weep with professional envy. The crystalline contingent had formed a study group that operated at computational speeds approaching small-scale artificial intelligence. Even the notoriously individualistic void dwellers had begun collaborating, their gravitational fields syncing to create group mind processing capabilities that frankly made the Academy's quantum computers feel inadequate. And then there was the human, who yesterday had asked Professor Denth whether gravity worked differently in space. Professor Denth, whose species had evolved in zero-G environments and whose ancestors had been manipulating gravitational fields since before most civilizations discovered fire, had stared at her with the expression of someone watching their entire worldview crumble in real time. Gravity, he had said slowly, his voice carrying harmonics that suggested he was reconsidering his career choices, works the same everywhere, miss. Oh good, she had interrupted with visible relief. I was worried I'd have to learn different math. The collective sigh from her classmates could have powered a small atmospheric processor. But here was the peculiar thing. Professor Denth had spent the rest of the lecture glancing at her with what could only be described as anticipation. Not the anticipation of watching a particularly slow-motion disaster, but the kind reserved for unexpected developments that promised to be significantly more interesting than initially predicted. It was a pattern that had begun to repeat across her classes with concerning regularity. In applied combat psychology, she had submitted an essay on fear-based motivation that read like it had been written by someone who'd learned about emotions from a poorly translated instruction manual. Professor Harith had returned it with a grade of 44% and a note that simply read, "Intriguing approach to deliberate misdirection." When she'd asked what that meant, Professor Harith's gravitational field had shifted into what passed for amusement among void dwellers. Nothing at all, he had said in a tone that suggested absolutely everything. Her classmates, meanwhile, had developed theories about her continued presence at the Academy that ranged from diplomatic necessity, to statistical anomaly, to the increasingly popular elaborate practical joke being played on the faculty by entities unknown. The betting pool on her expulsion date had reached impressive proportions, with the smart money riding on before midterms, and the optimists holding out for end of first semester. Nobody was betting on graduation. The human herself seemed blissfully unaware of her reputation as the Academy's most persistent academic disaster. She attended lectures with the determined focus of someone following a map written in a language they didn't quite speak. She took notes that looked like they'd been translated through several dead languages and a malfunctioning universal translator. She asked questions that made professors pause in that particular way that suggested they were reconsidering fundamental assumptions about reality. Today's example had occurred in Advanced Fleet Tactics, where Commander Flux, a multi-dimensional being whose very presence caused localized space-time hiccups, was explaining the intricacies of coordinated assault patterns. The key to successful multi-vector attacks, Flux intoned, their voice arriving from several different temporal coordinates simultaneously, lies in the synchronization of force deployment across dimensional barriers, while maintaining coherent command structures despite relativistic communication delay. The class absorbed this information like particularly gifted sponges. Notebooks filled with equations that would make theoretical physicists weep with envy. Holographic displays materialized showing perfect formations executing maneuvers that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. The human had raised her hand. Yes, Commander Flux inquired, their multi-dimensional attention focusing with the weight of collapsed stars. What if the other side just doesn't do what you expect them to do? The question hung in the air like a small but persistent gravitational anomaly. It was the sort of question that sounded profound until you thought about it, at which point it became either deeply stupid or dangerously insightful, depending on your perspective. Commander Flux's response had been to shift through several dimensional phases, while making sounds that suggested either deep contemplation or the early stages of a temporal paradox. Explain, they had finally managed. Well, the human had continued with the air of someone who hadn't realized they'd just asked a question that could unravel centuries of military theory. All these strategies assume everyone follows the same rules. But what if they're not trying to win the way you think winning works? The silence that followed could have been measured in geological epochs. Several students had turned to stare at her with expressions typically reserved for natural disasters or unexpected tax audit. But Commander Flux had spent the remainder of the class session redesigning their entire lecture series. After class, as students filed out in their usual clusters of academic superiority, the human had approached the commander's desk with a question about homework assignment. Her classmates had overheard her asking whether the tactical analysis was supposed to make sense or just look impressive, delivered in a tone that suggested she genuinely couldn't tell the difference. What they hadn't noticed was Commander Flux's response, delivered in dimensional frequencies inaudible to most species. Continue the performance, it's working beautifully. Later that evening, the Academy's faculty lounge buzzed with conversations that would have sounded like casual academic gossip to anyone not paying attention to the underlying harmonic frequencies, gravitational fluctuations, and temporal displacement patterns that constituted actual communication among the staff. The betting pool among students has reached remarkable proportions, Professor Vax chimed, his crystalline structure cycling through amused hues. They're now taking wagers on whether she'll accidentally destroy something before they expel her. The irony, Professor Harriot's gravitational field observed, is exquisite. Commander Flux materialized partially into their shared dimensional space, bringing with them the slight temporal distortion that made conversations with them feel like déjà vu having an identity crisis. Today's question about conventional assumptions was particularly well-timed, they noted. I believe she's reaching the limits of sustainable mediocrity. The other students are becoming suspicious. Professor Denth inquired, his zero-G adapted physiology, allowing him to float in orientations that made spatial geometry nervous. Quite the opposite, Vax harmonized. They're so convinced of her incompetence that they've stopped paying attention entirely. She could probably solve unified field theory on the blackboard, and they'd assume it was a particularly creative form of academic vandalism.
The conversation continued in frequencies that existed primarily as theoretical constructs, touching on subjects that would have made the Academy's official curriculum feel inadequate by comparison. But the underlying theme remained consistent. The human was approaching some sort of threshold, and when she crossed it, the results promised to be significantly more interesting than anyone, except possibly the faculty, was prepared for. In her dormitory room, the human sat at her desk, surrounded by textbooks that appeared to have been written by sadists for the benefit of masochists. Her latest assignment lay open before her, a comprehensive analysis of multi-species cooperation under extreme stress conditions. She stared at the blank page for several minutes, then began to write with the determined focus of someone who had absolutely no idea what they were doing but had gotten remarkably good at pretending otherwise. What she wrote would later be graded as a solid C- work, showing basic comprehension of fundamental concepts with room for significant improvement. What she actually produced was a theoretical framework that would revolutionize galactic military doctrine within the next 6 months. But that was tomorrow's problem.
Tomorrow's problem arrived ahead of schedule, as problems often do when you're least prepared to handle them with anything resembling competence or dignity. The emergency klaxons began wailing at 0347 Standard Galactic Time, which was either very late at night or very early in the morning, depending on your species' relationship with circadian rhythms and existential dread. The Academy's crystal spires pulsed from their usual serene blue to the sort of aggressive red that suggested someone somewhere had made decisions that were about to become everyone else's problem. Academy Director Xenthos, a being whose species had evolved from what could charitably be called living geometric theorems, materialized in the Central Assembly Hall, with the kind of dramatic flair that came naturally to entities who existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. Students stumbled in from their dormitories in various states of dress and consciousness, creating a scene that resembled a pajama party organized by beings who had never quite grasped the concept of pajamas. The human arrived wearing regulation sleepwear that somehow managed to look regulation adjacent at best, her hair achieving new heights of geometric impossibility that defied several laws of physics. She found a seat in the back, naturally, and proceeded to look as confused as everyone else, except possibly more so. "Students," Director Xenthos announced, their voice resonating through frequencies that made reality itself pay attention. "We are facing an unprecedented situation." A holographic display materialized above the assembly, showing what appeared to be a star chart, having a nervous breakdown. Entire sectors flickered in and out of existence. Trade routes dissolved into statistical improbabilities, and several important-looking planets seemed to be missing entirely. The hegemony of Keth has activated what they call the dissolution protocol. Xenthos continued, their geometric form shifting through configurations that suggested deep concern mixed with professional irritation. They have developed technology that can destabilize the quantum foundations of organized space within a radius of approximately 50 light-years. The assembled students made sounds that collectively translated to, "Oh, that's not good at all." The affected zones are expanding at roughly 1 light-year per standard day. Current projections suggest that unless the expansion is halted, approximately 40% of inhabited galactic space will become uninhabitable within the next solar cycle. The Etherian twins immediately began calculating evacuation scenarios, with the grim efficiency of beings who had been trained to think in terms of acceptable casualty rates. The crystalline contingent started analyzing the quantum mechanics involved, their harmonic discussions creating mathematical equations that hung in the air like particularly aggressive poetry. The Nexarians deployed their multiple arms to access every available database simultaneously, searching for precedents, solutions, or at least more detailed descriptions of exactly how doomed everyone was. The Void Dwellers, with their natural understanding of space-time manipulation, had gone very quiet, which among their species was equivalent to screaming. The human raised her hand. "Yes?" Director Xenthos inquired, their attention focusing with the weight of collapsed civilization. She began, with the confidence of someone who was about to say something that would either solve everything or make it significantly worse. "Why are they doing this?" The question landed in the assembly hall like a small but persistent logical paradox. It was on the surface exactly the sort of obvious question that everyone had been too sophisticated to ask. The kind of question that suggested either profound naivety or a disturbing ability to cut through complex strategic analysis to reach uncomfortable fundamental truth. Director Zenthos's geometric form cycled through several configurations that suggested they were accessing databases, consulting with advisory councils, and possibly questioning their career choices simultaneously. The Keth hegemony has declared that organized galactic civilization represents a fundamental violation of natural entropy and must be returned to its proper state of chaotic distribution, they finally announced. But the human continued with the persistence of someone who hadn't recognized that this was not the time for additional questions. Don't they live in organized civilization too? Won't they also, stop existing? Another silence descended, this one carrying the particular quality that suggested everyone was reconsidering basic assumptions about reality. The Keth leadership appears to have concluded that universal dissolution is preferable to continued existence within what they term artificially maintained systemic complexity. Zenthos explained in the tone of someone reading from a script written by philosophers, having a collective breakdown. The human blinked slowly, processing this information with the visible effort of someone trying to understand a joke that wasn't particularly funny. So they want to destroy everything including themselves because existing is too complicated. That appears to be an accurate summary of their position. Yes, that, the human said with the definitiveness of someone who had reached a conclusion that satisfied her personal standards of logical consistency, is stupid. The assembly hall fell silent. Not the contemplative silence of deep strategic thinking, but the profound silence of several hundred of the galaxy's brightest minds being forced to confront the possibility that millennia of sophisticated philosophical and military analysis had just been summarized by someone who had received a 39% on her advanced weapons systems exam. She continued, apparently unaware that she had just reduced complex geopolitical crisis to its most basic components. If you don't want to exist, you can just stop. You don't have to make it everyone else's problem. That's just rude. Director Zenthos's geometric form went through several rapid configuration changes that suggested either deep contemplation or a complete system crash. The Academy's finest strategic minds have been working on this problem for the past 72 hours, they announced. Our most advanced tactical simulations have failed to identify any viable solutions. The Keth technology appears to be fundamentally unassailable through conventional military or diplomatic means. The human looked around the assembly hall, taking in the sight of hundreds of brilliant students who had been trained since birth to solve exactly these kinds of problems, and who were now staring at holographic displays of expanding cosmic disaster with expressions of extremely educated helplessness. Have you tried asking them to stop? The silence that followed could have been used to calibrate extremely sensitive listening equipment. I beg your pardon, Director Zenthos inquired. Well, you said they think existence is too complicated, right? And they're going to all this trouble to build really complicated technology to destroy everything because it's too complicated. But that seems like more complicated than just not existing. Maybe they're confused about what they actually want. The human paused, looking thoughtful in the way that suggested she was working through a problem using methods that wouldn't appear in any textbook. Maybe if someone just talked to them like regular people instead of treating them like a strategic problem, they'd realize that destroying everything is actually way more work than just learning to be okay with things being complicated sometimes. Director Zenthos cycled through several configurations rapidly enough to create localized gravitational fluctuations. Miss, they began, then paused, consulting what appeared to be several internal databases. Your academic record indicates performance levels that would not typically qualify you for advanced strategic planning. Yeah, I'm not very good at tests, she admitted cheerfully. But this isn't really a test problem, is it? It's more like when people are having a bad day, and they decide everyone else should have a bad day too. Except instead of being mean at the grocery store, they're trying to dissolve the fundamental structure of reality. She stood up with the decisive movement of someone who had reached a conclusion that satisfied her personal standards of reasonable action. I think I should probably go talk to them. The assembly hall erupted into what could charitably be described as academic discussion, but which sounded more like several hundred highly educated beings having simultaneous nervous breakdowns in 17 different languages. Above the chaos, Director Zenthos's voice resonated with the authority of someone who had just decided to authorize what was quite possibly the most inadvisable diplomatic mission in galactic history. Prepare a diplomatic shuttle, they announced, and contact the faculty. I believe it's time we stopped pretending. In the back of the assembly hall, the human was gathering her things with the unhurried pace of someone who had somewhere to be but wasn't particularly worried about punctuality. Around her, the galaxy's finest strategic minds were discovering that sometimes the most sophisticated problems required solutions that couldn't be found in any textbook. Behind her, Professor Vax, Professor Harith, Commander Flux, and Professor Denth had materialized in a configuration that suggested they had been expecting this moment for quite some time. "How long have you known?" Director Zenthos inquired, their geometric form shifting into patterns that indicated a conversation that was about to become significantly more interesting. "Since the entrance exams," Professor Vax chimed, his crystalline structure cycling through satisfied hues. Her tactical analysis was submitted as a joke answer. It revolutionized 3 separate fields of military theory. "The mediocre grades were deliberate?" Zenthos asked, though their tone suggested they already knew the answer. "Beautifully maintained," Commander Flux observed from several temporal coordinates. "Though I suspect the performance is about to become unsustainable." The human had just volunteered to solve an interstellar crisis using methods that didn't exist in any manual, guided by principles that made academic sense to absolutely no one. It was exactly the sort of plan that could only work if you were too inexperienced to know it was impossible. The diplomatic shuttle that carried the human toward the expanding zone of cosmic dissolution was equipped with technology that could survive direct hits from stellar-class weapons, navigate through folded space-time, and maintain stable communication across dimensional barriers. It was, by any reasonable measure, a miracle of engineering that represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization's technological achievement. The humans spent the journey asking the pilot whether the buttons did anything important, and if she was allowed to touch them. The pilot, a seasoned diplomatic courier, who had navigated everything from trade disputes to full-scale wars, found himself explaining basic shuttle operations to someone who nodded along with the enthusiasm of a tourist getting directions to the gift shop. It was, he reflected later, probably the most surreal briefing of his career. When they reached the edge of Keth space, reality began to behave like a theoretical construct having an identity crisis. Stars flickered in and out of existence according to mathematical principles that made physicists weep. The very concept of distance became more of a suggestion than a rule. The human pressed her face against the observation window and said, "Wow, it's like space is having a really bad day." The Keth hegemony's response to diplomatic contact had been characteristically direct. A transmission consisting entirely of mathematical proofs, demonstrating why organized existence was fundamentally unsustainable, followed by detailed instructions for achieving optimal entropy distribution through controlled universal dissolution. It was the sort of communication that typically required teams of xenolinguists and philosophers to interpret. The human listened to the translation and said, "Oh, they're really committed to this whole thing, aren't they?" When the shuttle docked with the Keth flagship, a structure that resembled what would happen if abstract mathematics decided to become a spaceship, the human was met by beings whose very presence caused localized reality distortion. They existed as living equations, their thought processes visible as cascading chains of logical proofs that hung in the air like particularly aggressive philosophical arguments. The lead Keth entity manifested as a series of interconnected theorems that somehow conveyed deep existential exhaustion. "You represent the Academy forces?" it inquired through mathematical notation that translated as profound disappointment with the universe in general. "I guess," the human replied, "I'm not really forces though. I'm more like concerned citizen." What followed was a conversation that would be studied by diplomatic historians for generations, assuming there were any generations left to study anything. The Keth entities presented their case with the methodical precision of beings who had reduced all of existence to a series of logical proofs. Organized civilization, they demonstrated through elegant mathematical arguments, was unsustainable. Complexity led inevitably to chaos. Order was merely delayed entropy. Therefore, the most rational solution was accelerated universal dissolution. The human listened with the patient attention of someone trying to follow directions to a location they'd never heard of. "But," she said when they finished, "you're still here, talking to me.
making complicated arguments about why complicated things are bad. Isn't that kind of complicated? The pause that followed could have been measured in cosmic epoch. The Keth entities cycled through logical frameworks with the speed of supercomputers having collective nervous breakdowns. The process of dissolution requires temporary maintenance of organizational structures, one entity finally managed. Right, but after you dissolve everything, then what? You'll still exist, but there won't be anything to do. Won't that be boring? Another pause, this one carrying the weight of beings confronting a logical paradox they hadn't considered. Boredom is a function of organized consciousness. Another entity observed. Post-dissolution existence will transcend such limitations. So you'll exist, but you won't be conscious enough to know you exist. That sounds like being dead with extra step. The collective silence from the Keth entities suggested they were accessing computational resources that existed in several dimensions simultaneously. The human continued with the relentless logic of someone who had never learned that some questions weren't supposed to be asked. Look, I get that existence is complicated and sometimes really annoying. Trust me, I spend most of my time confused about basic stuff. But isn't being confused better than not being anything at all? At least when you're confused, there's still a chance you'll figure something out eventually. She paused, looking around at the reality-distorting architecture of the Keth ship. Besides, you've built all this really impressive technology just to destroy everything. That seems like a lot of work for beings who think complexity is bad. Maybe you actually like complicated things more than you want to admit. The lead entity manifested several new mathematical constructs, each one representing increasingly frantic attempts to maintain logical consistency. Our analysis indicates, your analysis is probably really smart, the human interrupted with the gentle firmness of someone correcting a fundamental misunderstanding. But maybe you're analyzing the wrong thing. Instead of asking how do we stop existence from being complicated, maybe try asking how do we get better at being okay with complicated things. What happened next would be debated by philosophers for centuries. The Keth entities, confronted with the possibility that their entire existential framework might be based on a simple category error, began cycling through logical processes at speeds that caused localized space-time instability. The human waited patiently, like someone giving a friend time to remember where they put their keys. Finally, the lead entity spoke. You suggest that our solution addresses the wrong problem. I think maybe you're just having a really bad day that's lasted a really long time, and you decided the problem was the day instead of figuring out how to have better days. The silence that followed was different from the others. It carried the particular quality of minds that had just discovered they'd been trying to solve an equation by destroying mathematics instead of learning better math. 3 hours later, the Keth hegemony announced the deactivation of their dissolution protocol. Their official statement, translated through 17 layers of mathematical abstraction, essentially read, "We have reconsidered our approach to existential complexity and decided to try therapy instead." The human returned to the academy to find herself surrounded by professors who were no longer bothering to hide their satisfaction. "Congratulations," Director Xanthos announced, their geometric forms cycling through patterns that suggested deep approval mixed with professional relief. "You have just prevented the dissolution of approximately 40% of galactic civilization using methods that don't appear in any textbook." "Thanks," she replied. "Though I still don't understand why everyone made it so complicated. They just needed someone to listen." Professor Vax's crystalline structure shifted to warm gold tones. "That precisely is why we always knew." "Knew what?" "That you were never the least noteworthy student in the academy," Commander Flux observed from several temporal coordinates. "You were always the most noteworthy. You just approached problems like a human instead of trying to think like us." The human blinked slowly, processing this information with her characteristic expression of polite confusion. "So, all those bad grades?" "Deliberate," Professor Harriot's gravitational field chuckled. "We needed you to maintain the illusion that you were failing, so you wouldn't start thinking like an academic. The moment you began analyzing problems like a trained strategist," Professor Dent added, "you would have lost the very perspective that makes you invaluable." The human looked around at the assembled faculty, then down at her regulation uniform that somehow managed to look regulation adjacent at best. So I've been accidentally solving problems by being too confused to know they were unsolvable. Exactly, Director Xanthos confirmed. And now that you've saved galactic civilization, you can go back to pretending to barely pass your exams while we quietly restructure our entire educational philosophy around the radical concept that sometimes the best way to solve impossible problems is to be too inexperienced to know they're impossible. The human nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense, which it probably did from her perspective. Cool, she said. Can I go get lunch now? Preventing universal dissolution makes me hungry. As she walked away, the faculty exchanged what passed for meaningful looks among beings who existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. She was, they agreed, still the least noteworthy student in the academy, and that, they had always known, was exactly what made her the most important.